everyone, and welcome to our presentation, Science and a Flaming Sword, the Neurospirituality of Religious Temperament. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Dr. Michael Ferguson is an instructor in neurology at Harvard Medical School and the Neurospirituality Research Director at the Center for Brain Circuit Therapeutics at Harvard Medical School's Brigham and Women's Hospital. He is also a fellow at the Center for the Study of World Religions and a lecturer on neurospirituality at Harvard Divinity School. Dr. Ferguson additionally serves as the first-year wellness director at Harvard College, where he teaches the course Cognitive Neuroscience of Meditation, for which he has received a Distinguished Teaching Award from Harvard's Office of Undergraduate Education. Congratulations. Dr. Ferguson earned his doctorate in bioengineering at the University of Utah, where he conducted brain imaging research on ecstatic religious experience. He also trained as a postdoctoral fellow at Cornell University and Harvard Medical School before joining the faculty at Harvard. He is conducting groundbreaking research through his Neurospirituality lab, including a first-of-its-kind longitudinal study on hesychastic prayer. Dr. Ferguson is deeply interested in multidisciplinary work spanning science, medicine, and mysticism. He is a leading force in integrating neurosciences and spirituality studies. We are delighted to host him here at the School of Theology and Ministry of Boston College for what should be a fascinating presentation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ferguson.
Thank you so much for that very gracious introduction and for this wonderful opportunity to come and speak with you. I will say that I was looking at the display of icons outside before starting my talk, and I think that might have been a mistake because I'm feeling very tenderly now. So we better talk about science and get out of these feelings here. My talk, I'll say, was titled before I realized that this was actually occurring on the feast day of the archangels. And so a nice happy coincidence there. Let's start by talking about this word, neurospirituality. It's of course a composite of neuro and spirituality, referencing the brain, and then the human quest for the sacred. As we're putting neuroscience and spirituality into conversation with each other, a lot of questions arise. And depending on which side of the river I'm located on at any given time, the sets of questions are different from one another. If I'm on the Boston side of the river at the Longwood Medical Campus, usually the questions have something to do with why spirituality. And the answers go something like this: well, spirituality remains a pervasive cultural fact in societies across the globe. Empirical studies have linked various elements of spirituality to adaptive and maladaptive aspects of functioning. And clients and patients themselves are interested in therapeutic approaches that are spiritually sensitive and integrative. And while all of these points are true, I'll also let you in on a secret. This doesn't tap into the heart of my real motivations. If I'm on the Cambridge side of the river in my other universe at the Divinity School, the question is usually framed something more like this: why neuroscience? And there's this resistance, there's this skepticism about the encroachment of brain scientists into every corner of academia and humanities and aspect of society imaginable. Well, I would say that particularly if we're coming from a Christian spiritual perspective, it's really instructive for us to remember that the bookends of the gospel message have to do with incarnation and resurrection. I guess there is a way to escape if we go into full-tilt Gnosticism, but it's very difficult to get away from the stuff of the body if we're really serious about Christian spirituality. Even more specifically within Catholic theology, you have this teaching that's articulated in the Catechism of the Catholic Church that the unity of soul and body is so profound that one has to consider the soul as the form of the body. In other words, it is because of its spiritual soul that the body made of matter becomes a living human body. Spirit and matter in humans are not two natures united, but rather their union forms a single nature. I mean, we could stop there and just contemplate for the next 60 minutes, truly. As I hinted at, the real motivation for me is something that is more transcendent than a list of logical arguments, or than, even for that matter, something that you could find in a handbook of positive psychology, but it really gets down to just the pure wonder of the topical content. Humans, for as long as we have been human, have been making efforts to map existence. Ancient efforts to make sense of the stars, to track the movements of the cosmos without, which in more contemporary modern scientific times have been coupled with highly technological instrumentations to get even finer glimpses at more distant galaxies. I would offer to you that there is an equally, if not richer, cosmos within. And again, as long as humans have been humaning, we have been introspecting, searching those cosmos within. And again, in our modern technological age of science, we're developing increasingly powerful instruments to pair that contemplative, introspective impulse with objective measurements so that we can get renewed perspectives on that interiority. I have to acknowledge from the outset that all of this work that I'm about to share with you takes a team. You know, it would be amazing if I were able to stand here and say, I did this all by myself, but that is not the way that any of this works. And so behind the scenes, there are co-authors, there are mentors, there are students who have done an incredible job of getting us to a point where we feel confident enough to say that we're producing new knowledge about the neuroscience of spirituality. I'd like to start our conceptual walk together today with the first neurospirituality experiment that I did in graduate school. Maybe it's just because I feel a sense of familiarity with so many of you in the audience that I'll get a little bit more autobiographical than I had planned to do. At the time, I had recently left the LDS faith. And as you know, is pretty psychologically typical, when people have a faith crisis or a faith transition or a faith exodus, there's a lot of feelings that get associated with that. And so for me, there was a lot of emotion that was wrapped up in my interest to investigate religious experiences in the LDS context. Hold that thought, because I'll come back to how that shaped some of my hypotheses, and then how some of those hypotheses were defied by data. We designed a task-based fMRI experiment, that's functional magnetic resonance imaging, to look inside of the brains of practicing Latter-day Saints when they were reading the Book of Mormon, when they were praying, and when they were having experiences that they reported to be communion with the sacred. They were in this comically large brain scanner, not at all a natural environment for having a religious or a spiritually ecstatic experience. And you can see they had a screen hovering over them as they were lying in there, on which text from the Book of Mormon, sacred central scripture in the Mormon faith, was being displayed. They also had a button box on their chest, so they could literally press the button and indicate to us in real time when they were feeling the Spirit. What we were then able to do is to go back and look at their brain activity at each of those moments when they specifically said, I'm feeling the Spirit of God right now, and identify what was uniquely occurring at each of those moments across each of those participants. And one of the hallmark neural signatures was increased activity in a dopaminergic reward center called the nucleus accumbens. I'll say, though, that to me, the more important finding here wasn't which neural correlates survived all of our statistical analyses and computational thresholding. The most important finding to me was that any areas of the brain survived our statistical analyses and computational thresholding. In other words, this was groundbreaking for me to see that we could put someone in a contemporary brain scanning machine, have them perform in such an unnatural environment religious and spiritual tasks, then have them actually encounter what they identified as the divine. And then finally, to see that there was a correspondence reliably across all of the participants in the brain. If you're interested more in this specific study, I'd invite you to check out my TEDx talk titled "This is Your Brain on God" on YouTube. You can find it readily using that search string. And now a new chapter unfolded for me once I finished my graduate work and I moved from the University of Utah to Cornell. There aren't quite as many Latter-day Saints in Ithaca, New York, and so my research took a different turn. Rather than looking at peak religious experiences, I was looking at the architectural diagram of the human brain. I'll tip my hand a little bit and say that because there is a particular theological proposition in Mormonism, namely that the glory of God is intelligence, I was very interested in understanding from a neuroscientific perspective, what is it that intelligence is doing in the brain? How is it operating? How is it manifesting? It turns out that if you do a data-driven approach to looking at the wiring diagram of the human brain, that the top 3 components of the human wiring diagram are readily recognizable in cognitive neuroscience as first an ensemble of sensory networks. So things like your visual system, the somatomotor system, and sensory networks for your body. The second component is readily recognizable as what's come to be known as the default mode network. That's related to things like creativity and openness. And the third network is what's known as the frontoparietal network because it integrates connections from the frontal areas and the parietal areas of the brain, which are called association cortices in the brain. And those are involved in functions like intellect and reasoning. All right, so as I had said previously, at that point in my life, I had stepped away from my LDS faith, but had that gaping hole in my heart. And there was this existential vacuum wanting to be filled. And there was Aristotle ready to rush in and to fill it. And so for a period of time, I had a very hot love affair with the mind of Aristotle, and particularly through the pages of the De Anima. And as I was reading the De Anima and recognizing this hierarchical pattern of sensitive, imaginative, intellective faculties that were typifying the function of the form of the human, I started to realize, wait, there's a little bit of a spooky correspondence here between the things that Aristotle's describing through his philosophical methods and the things that I was encountering using data-driven approaches to the human brain. And so it alerted me there's something here to keep scratching at. And in particular, that something can be framed as hylomorphism, which is a compound Greek word for hyle, which is matter, and morphe, which is form. And the central perspective in hylomorphism is that there's something about that unity of matter and form that is very generative for us to closely consider. This is a strong contrast to a dualism of soul and body, where we're thinking about the soul as something that's, a ghostly substance, like a Casper the ghost, to put it into kind of a cartoon image. and that inhabits the body and animates it in that fashion. And so, especially operating in the context of contemporary neuroscience, this hylomorphic paradigm became a very strong candidate for philosophically understanding this approach of neurospirituality. Interim summary here is that by the time that I was finishing up with graduate school, I was realizing there are very powerful ways that we can look in the brain and localize spiritual phenomena. And I was recognizing in my first postdoctoral fellowship that there are also these incredible philosophical paradigms that have existed for thousands of years that might help us interpret some of the scientific findings that we're encountering. All right, so after my first postdoc, I then moved from Cornell here to Boston and started up at Harvard Medical School, where more recent work has been looking at the neural basis for trait differences related to spirituality and religiosity. So let's carefully contrast a state difference from a trait difference. So a state difference is something that's experiential, it's transient, it's an elevated event or a moment. Whereas trait differences are really asking the question about what is it in an individual's stable disposition that makes them more or less inclined toward a particular set of feelings or behaviors or thoughts. Our discovery that was most recently published actually landed on the cover of a journal called Biological Psychiatry. And here we identified a neural circuit for a unified presentation of spirituality and religiosity derived from patients with brain lesions. Okay, there's a lot to unpack just right here. So first, let me unpack this unified approach. There are, of course, so many aspects of spirituality and religiosity. There's so many psychometrics out there to look at these different aspects, to measure them, to quantify them, to understand how these different facets of the spiritual and religious life are interrelated to one another. Okay, going down this road of research, though, our first sets of questions are about what do all of these things have in common with each other? By way of rough analogy, we can think about the construct G, which is the psychological construct for general intelligence. And it's this idea that, yeah, you can do all kinds of different cognitive tests, and those represent all kinds of different cognitive functions. But the theory is that there's still something unifying about them, some reason that they all have a positive correlation. They all kind of hang together, even though they're, of course, differentiable functions. So you could think about this as R or S or whatever letter you want to put on this unification idea, that there's something domain general about spirituality and religiosity that we can measure. And in particular, we used a trait called spiritual acceptance to start approaching this question. Here are some example items for spiritual acceptance. Sometimes I have felt my life was being directed by a spiritual force greater than any human being. And participants respond on a numbered scale, whether they strongly disagree or strongly agree. I think that most things that are called miracles are just chance. And that gets reverse scored. So if they say I strongly agree, then they don't get spirituality points. Religious experiences have helped me understand the real purpose of my life. And so there's a list of self-report items like this. Each of them, the individual is placing a number on whether they strongly disagree or strongly agree, and then we sum them up. And there's a single value, and we say, this is your number for spiritual acceptance. Now, what we did was we looked at a group of patients who are going to be getting neural surgery to resect an area of the brain, in other words, to have a focal part of their brain surgically removed. Why on earth would we do that? Well, there's a couple of reasons why we would do that. One of the first maxims of science is that correlation does not equal causation. There's really, really important correlational work that is being done with brain imaging. But it's likewise really important for us to recognize the limitations on the nature of the data and on the inferences that we can draw from a correlation, especially if we're starting to talk about something like spirituality in the brain, where there could be bottom-up influences. Perhaps the brain is driving something that's expressing as a difference in spirituality. Or there could be a top-down influence where there's something that's more difficult to pin down or to model than a simple organic bottom-up approach. But that's not going to really be illuminated if we're only looking at correlations. When we're looking at a brain lesion, we're looking at an area of the brain that is no longer functioning by definition. A brain lesion is an area that's been damaged and that there's no activity there. What we do, though, is look not just at the lesion location itself, but also everything that it's connected to. The brain is an exquisitely interconnected system. And so if you have one area that goes out, there's a whole circuit that's going to go out with it. You can, by way of analogy, think about the old Christmas lights. Oh man, and how much frustration has gone into untangling those and trying to find which is the one light bulb that is making this whole string go out. And it's kind of like that with the brain. One spot goes out and boom, the circuit goes down with it. We then looked at those circuits that were impacted by the brain lesions and then correlated those circuits with the change in spirituality that the individual reported after surgery, contrasted with before surgery. And what we saw is that across 88 patients for whom we had a brain lesion map, a brain circuit map, and a change in their self-report score for spirituality, that there was a top association in a brainstem region called the periaqueductal gray. Okay, now, oh man, there's so much to unpack just here too. One of the reasons why I say with just a little bit of shock and even a hint of incredulity in my voice, the brainstem, is because the brainstem is such an evolutionarily ancient structure of the brain. It's so fundamental. And yet when we think about spirituality, very often we think about something that is extraordinarily abstract or esoteric, or that only must have come online recently in the grand drama of biology. But what we're seeing is actually the top associations with circuits driving this domain general spiritual and religious disposition are deeply rooted in core fundamental areas of the nervous system. Partially because this was an unexpected finding, and also because it was a data-driven as opposed to a hypothesis-driven result. We really wanted to validate this as best we could. We had a second data set of brain lesion patients, and in too rapid of a summary, what we did was derive the top brain circuit association for spirituality in each of the data sets independently, and observe that both of them were localizing to the same region of the periaqueductal gray. Then we swapped the brain lesions and the circuit solutions between the two sets and tested whether in opposite data sets from one another, the brain lesions from data set A also mapped onto the brain circuit from data set B, and vice versa, if the brain lesions from data set B mapped onto the brain circuit from data set A, and saw in that cross-validation fashion that there was a significant association in both directions. And so we're starting to get more confident at this point. The periaqueductal gray itself is a paradoxical brain region. On the one hand, it's involved in fear conditioning. On the other, it's central in nurturing behaviors and altruism. Again, there are just so many moments here where it's like, I could just go on retreat and contemplate this paradox for a very long time of the relationship of fear and self-sacrificing love. It's not typically considered as heavyweight of a scientific data point, but on Twitter, there was a tweet from a neurologist who was sharing a patient case. This is a patient who their primary complaint was that they were unable to cry and to feel love. And when they looked in the patient's brain, it turns out that they had a lesion specific and focused right there on the periaqueductal gray. Once again, particularly given a lot of the stereotyped associations of emotive expression and the affect of love in particular with spirituality, this is at least convergent with our hypothesis that the periaqueductal gray and its circuits are related to a domain general spirituality and religiosity. Other corroborating evidence comes from a 2020 meta-analysis of compassion. This is looking at 16 different fMRI tasks across multiple labs all over the world with different subjects, where essentially they were putting people into a brain scanner and having them do some kind of a compassion meditation. Not explicitly religious, and in some cases explicitly not religious. And they, in this meta-analysis, were asking, what are the areas across all of these 16 studies where there is something in the brain that reliably is activated during these compassion practices? And at this point, you're not going to be totally surprised when I say that one of the key areas was in the periaqueductal gray, which has been extracted and blown up here for clarity of illustration. Some of the current work that I'm doing is examining relationships between compassion meditation and between affective mysticism. I have like an entire circuitous side monologue about the psychometrics associated with mysticism. Just like the short teaser of it is that there's a lot of potentially productive work that we need to do across disciplines of spiritual theology and of human sciences. Right now, the measures that are most often used to study things like mysticism are so heterogeneous. So they're strong efforts. I'm not knocking the legitimacy, the validity, the earnestness of the efforts to create scientific tools to measure things as complex as mystical experiences. But for example, when you're asking within the same survey, have you had an experience where everything seemed to disappear from your mind until you were conscious of only a void? And at the same time, have you had an experience where you felt the presence or the energy of God? So those are like on opposite sides of the universe. And so to put those into the same survey and say that it's measuring the same construct is really problematic, to say the least. Here, I was specifically looking at affective mysticism. So those types of questions that are getting at, have you felt something that you identify as a presence or the energy of God? And much to my relief, because it validates what we've already published, there's an association with the periaqueductal gray for those to whom statistics means anything, with an absolute R value of 0.38 and a significant p-value. This is a scientific indication of a significant relationship between compassion meditation and affective mysticism, but I'll say that, you know what? Turns out the Catholic mystics beat us by about 1,000 years. There's a strong history in Christianity of affective meditations, of compassion meditations on the suffering of Jesus' body, especially through the eyes of his mother, in order to put the soul in a position where it's having these affective encounters, and an argument is made that the soul is learning to feel as it ought. This, to me, again, is just such a rich conversation that we really ought to develop between the neurosciences and between theological studies about the processes of transforming fear to love. I mean, you know, you're going to get sick of hearing me say this, but again, like, we could just go on retreat and talk about this scripturally, developmentally in our own individual lives. in, the particular sociocultural moment in which we find ourselves. And so the fact, again, that this paradoxical relationship of fear and love are both very canonically localized to the same region of the brain, and moreover, the same region of the brain that we're identifying to have a core causal role in human spirituality, it's just delicious. All right, so that was the good news. In a little bit more complicated news, when we do a characterization of the periaqueductal gray circuitry, we screen through the brain circuits that cause an array of clinical symptoms. And one of the things that I'm looking at is whether there are spatial similarities between the brain circuits that cause clinical symptoms and the brain circuits for the particular aspects of spirituality and religiosity that I'm studying. And it turns out that, yes, there is a similarity between the brain circuits for the periaqueductal gray, and they happen to be with the brain circuits for delusions. And at this point, we can welcome Richard Dawkins on stage and congratulate him for his intuitions that, yeah, there is an association between religiosity and delusionality. Part of that, if we look more closely at the brain, may be due to the fact that the periaqueductal gray has what is called an anti-correlated functional association with the frontoparietal network that is involved in reasoning. By anti-correlated, what I mean is that when the periaqueductal gray circuit activity goes up, then the tendency in a typical brain is for the activity in those frontoparietal brain circuits that mediate critical reasoning to go down. Okay? One of the reasons why a mother will say their baby is the most beautiful baby in the entire world. Is it? Can we really quantify that as a fact? But there's something about these experiences of rapture and affect that transcend, the simple, linear, logical analysis of life. So one of the things in the spirit, especially of it being St. Michael's feast day, that I would posit here is that we can imagine these typical anti-correlated patterns being strategically and intentionally brought into a concerted harmony with one another, where our imaginative faculties and our intellective faculties can be in union. And a cognitive ideal, indeed, is a dual engagement of the type of openness that is associated with default mode network activity and the type of intellect that is associated with frontoparietal controlled network activity. And in fact, this comes from a cognitive science paper where the conclusion is that intellect may be unlikely to lead to the creativity required for genius. Perhaps then, genius is most likely to emerge given the combination of high intellect and high openness. And one must risk madness to achieve genius. All right, in a final sequence here, I'd like to share with you some of the work that I'm developing, more specifically in the context of the medical school. This is a paradigm that I'm terming clinical neurospirituality or spiritual therapeutics. At the Longwood Medical Campus, there is this really interesting mural, and it contains this statement that the evolution of medicine is in reality the history of man and his religion. The mural then has panels across culture and across time that demonstrate such an intimate union of medicine and religion that they're often indistinguishable from one another. Think again within the Christian tradition of titles for Jesus, the great physician, doctrine related to the Holy Spirit, the giver of life. There's an intimacy here between healing and between divinity. Today, though, we live in a situation where health sciences and spirituality have this wall that had been built right down the middle of them. It really begs the question, is this optimal? Some data is coming out to point to the effectiveness of spirituality integrated with psychotherapy. In particular, there are benefits for patients with mood, anxiety, trauma, substance use, psychosis, feeding and eating disorders, and other personality disorders, and that these are patients with various levels of acuity in their symptoms. One of my questions is what happens if we apply these brain circuit methods to these spiritual phenotypes, and in particular, can we introduce a higher degree of precision to this integration of health sciences and spirituality? So although there may have been compelling historical reasons to build a wall between science and spirituality, my overarching argument is that that time has passed. Also, that by reintegrating health, healing, and spirituality, we're actually not pursuing a new idea, but it is a project that we're now technically equipped to pursue in a first-of-its-kind empirical fashion. Brain circuit mapping and also stimulation, so things like transcranial magnetic stimulation, where we can focus on a really specific brain circuit target to activate it or to inhibit it in the desired therapeutic direction. It's an ideal scientific platform for this project. The vision here then is of unifying health sciences and spirituality studies for the benefit of patients. And the hope is that by identifying brain circuits associated with diverse spiritual practices, we may eventually give clinicians a toolkit of evidence-based spiritual therapeutics that they can match to patient-specific symptoms. Lastly here, I'll share that I do teach over at the Divinity School, and particularly for those who are in the Boston Theological Interreligious Consortium. Did I say that right for BTI? In the BTI, we'll just call it the BTI. I would love to have you check out my classes. I also did directed readings in mysticism and neuroscience, which was really fun. You put Bertrand Russell and Pseudo Dennis in the same room, and man, those two really have at it with each other. And then, as was mentioned, I'm teaching a cognitive neuroscience and meditation class, and also building a community of meditative, contemplative seekers in the Harvard ecosystem, but would love that to expand into more of a multi-school collaborative. Lastly, for those who are tuning in remotely, but who want to follow some of the work that I'm doing, I'd invite you to check out my website, neuromichael.com. And I also am on Twitter and send updates for things that I'm doing and for discoveries that are coming out. And then finally, I do have a website where I try to translate some of the more technical aspects of neurospirituality into something that's more generally accessible. And there's also a fair share of music and songwriting that I end up posting there as well. With that, I want to thank you again so much for your attendance and attention, and would be very happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ferguson. So if you do have a question, just raise your hand and just wait for the microphone to come to you, please.
So first off, as an undergraduate studying psychology, I have butterflies in my stomach to be able to perhaps take up this torch and continue this research. But you were talking about how this needs to be kind of interdisciplinary and multifaceted. So if someone were to be criticizing this work through a spiritual perspective, how might you defend against the accusation that this kind of work implies that someone's ability to access the divine could be like physically or, you know, chemically like impaired, and through that maybe even like access to revelation or salvation in that respect, if their ability to feel this through the PAC is you know impaired? Is that like something that you actually would have to defend against in terms of a theological perspective?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I would say, so I've got a two-part answer to that. Very fair and valid question. The first is, okay, let's think about it in positive terms. Are there things that we could say make an individual more disposed toward grace, toward divine communion? And I would say, well, if there's not, what are we doing with the sacraments? Like, what are we doing with any type of behavioral participation in the religious life if there aren't things that can make a person more disposed? And so then by the logical flip of that, if there are things that make a person more disposed, well, there are going to be things that make a person less disposed. The second thing that I would say that comes to mind is that I'm really glad I'm not the final judge. That if you take seriously the concept of some all-knowing, benevolent assessment of the human being, then like how could that all-knowing, benevolent assessment not take into account all of the variables in the equation? And I guess the third thing I'll say is that I'm not a theologian, so I defer to those in the audience with more knowledge than I have.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sharon.
Hi, Sharon.
I am the Director of Spiritual Care at Salem Hospital. A third of our beds are behavioral health beds in locked units. And help!
Yeah.
It would be lovely to have something more therapeutic than simply listening presence. However, listening presence is powerful.
Yeah.
I'm not undercutting it. I think it's a beautiful thing. But for behavioral health folks with a diagnosis, it sure would be nice to have more than just listening presence.
I mean, my immediate response to what you're sharing here is that it would be wonderful to cultivate a conversation and to see what we'd be able to derive. Thank you.
Thank you for your work and your presentation. It seems that behind your research there is an idea of Christian spirituality, but at other times it seems to be like a universal spirituality, something that go across different cultures. So I was wondering if you could share some of your assumptions about the concept of spirituality.
Sure. No, that's a great question. I would say that taking a step back, that we have to look at even some of the assumptions about the human brain. You know, just even the assumption that there is something called a human connectome that is a normative wiring diagram that is universally applicable to all human beings. Like, that's an assumption right there. Turns out that it's an assumption that is seeming to play out pretty nicely when we're doing these similar analyses across pretty radically different cultures. And so this is a perennial question about the degree to which we can universalize versus the degree to which, like, we're either being sloppy or even, dangerous in the ways that we're making some kind of universalizing assumptions. I'll say that certainly this is also a question whose answer depends on which side of the river I'm located on at any given time. Where when I'm at the medical school, like, oh yeah, we want like something that is universally true about every patient with a stroke in this particular location of the brain. Versus when I'm on the Cambridge side of the river at the Divinity School with colleagues who are far more invested in looking at sociocultural variables, then I get a lot more input and criticism for the need to pay finer attention to how those differences play out at the level of the individual. As I mentioned, this particular study was trying to find something that is generally true. And given that the study was conducted in Western post-industrial nations that have a predominantly Christian influence, the conclusions are limited that we're able to draw from it. One of the fond hopes that I have for ongoing research is that we'll be able to do similar types of work in more culturally diverse populations, in more socioeconomically diverse populations outside of just, again, the post-industrial West. to test this exact thing. Like, is this association that we're seeing something that is idiosyncratic to a Western concept of Christian spirituality, to a theistic concept of spirituality, given what has been demonstrated with compassion meditations that were either non-Christian or like non-religious or non-spiritual, that there was an association in a very common area. It does lead me to think that we're getting close to something that has, again, I know that the word universal, that people get really, really jittery around that word for understandable reasons, but something that has, we'll say, a very widespread application or interpretation. But maybe the last thing that I'll say, and then come to a period at the end of this reply, is that we're admittedly looking at things that are not totalizing explanations. Just because we see something that is significantly associated, it doesn't mean that it's deterministic. And that's a really crucial differentiation that gets lost in the translation many times. That we can see something that is reliably, significantly, reproducibly contributing to a particular outcome. But it doesn't mean that it's 100% determining that outcome. And so, yes, so many personalized, idiosyncratic, intersectional variables have to come into play to get a full, complete picture.
Do an online question next. You pointed out a connection between the glory of God and intelligence in the LDS faith. Is there a neurobiological home to what Thomas Aquinas discusses as the reason rationality that connects the human person to the divine? The frontoparietal network makes the most sense, but is there anything more specific? And if so, how can this help inform our future ministerial practice?
Yeah, so I've got to admit, you're talking to someone who has a very fond affection for Bonaventure. And so if you're really going to make me talk about Aquinas and rationality or Bonaventure and affect, I'm just going to say the seraphic versus the angelic. Come on, okay. Okay, maybe this is a little bit too insider of a joke here. But this is from my neophyte level of understanding that the question really points us into something that's been a long-standing debate within the tradition about intellect versus love, I guess we could say, and which one is going to propel us more quickly and to a higher degree of communion with the divine. Within the LDS tradition specifically, there are some really interesting ways in which Joseph Smith then elaborates on this proposition that the glory of God is intelligence. In particular, he talks in his doctrines about how spirit is matter, and that spirit is matter more refined. This became really, really interesting to me when I was doing that study on the human connectome at Cornell, because what we were seeing is that intelligence at the level of the brain was correlated with increased synchronous activity within a network. Okay, so follow me for a couple of logical steps here, because this will take me, a little bit longer than just a simple yes or no reply to intellect versus love being the faculty of choice here. But if we talk then about synchrony within a network, that starts to sound very similar to, by way of analogy, synchrony within the sonic landscape. Okay, so sound versus music is differentiated by the quality as opposed to the kind. Music is sound that's more refined. So now look again at the neural activity that's correlated with intelligence. It's neural activity that's more refined. So there's a way in which I think that there could be a Thomistic reading of Joseph Smith, if you will, that the glory of God being intelligence may plausibly be pointing to there being this increased synchrony across a functional hierarchy. Especially then if you start thinking about celestial hierarchies and what that means for there to be increased harmony across a celestial hierarchy. Like, oh, that starts to sound pretty, I was going to say Catholic, but it starts to sound pretty convergent with things that you get from the early tradition. This is also making me want to speculate a little bit about seizure and the relationship of seizure with spirituality, but I'll go ahead and pause there and let someone else ask a question about seizure and spirituality.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to ask a skeptical question, but it's not because I don't appreciate your work. I guess when it comes to the field of like medicine or neuroscience, the hard empirical sciences, this work makes sense to justify in some sense the use of spirituality when it comes to health or therapeutics or within the neuroscience community. But what exactly is it giving to the spirituality community? Because it seems to just verify what we already know is true. And so I'm just wondering, like, leaving this place, how is it adding anything to experience that experience itself doesn't prove to be true?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would, again, my first response is not going to be very satisfying to you, because the first thing that comes to mind for me is looking at the precision alignments between symptom circuits and between spiritual practices, to where, yeah, we can speculate and make guesses about, okay, this particular type of contemplative discipline might be helpful for this particular type of movement disorder or for this particular type of mood disorder. But on a certain level, like, it is a large amount of intuition and speculation that's going into it, which is, it's fine. There's nothing wrong per se with being intuitive and speculative. But imagine a scenario where we were able to say, like, okay, this particular apophatic variety of meditation, this particular affective and compassionate meditation, this particular ritual performance, that here is now a suite of precise brain circuits that are being elevated in terms of their activity and their function by this particular suite of practices, and then being able to match that to a set of symptoms and to make unexpected alliances. So one that I'll just tease that, I'm hesitant to talk too authoritatively about findings that are emerging and still need to be replicated, but it seems that there is a strong association between dogmatic certainty and the suppression of pain. And so interesting to think in terms of the possible connection of some kind of pain management intervention being one where an individual is primed in terms of, like, what are the things that you hold to be certain with a dogmatic level of confidence. This again, though, this gets into more of a translational therapeutic type of application, which I recognize is not exactly the same thing as your question with regard to, like, how does brain scanning increase the intensity of theophany? And as indirect, again, as it is, I'll say that I would invite an extended conversation, especially into a reverent understanding of the anamnesis. In the Eucharist, there is this injunction, remember me. If we look closely both at the Greek and at the neuroscience, it's different than the thief on the cross who said, Lord, remember me in your kingdom. It was, nethys. I'm not a Greek scholar, but you've got a series here of remember me, nessis. Someone help me out in the Greek, Father. You've got to know. Versus amnesis, a forgetting of that which was cohesive. And then anamnesis, like bring back together that which was scattered, but did have a wholeness at one point. What we're told to do is anamnesis. We've forgotten God. And we're to bring back together that which was whole, but that we lost. The thief's prayer to God was, just keep holding me. You never forgot me. Keep holding me. So then if we look at the neural processes that are associated with memory, there is a scattering through the brain of the information. And when we're remembering something, we're precisely gathering in that information that has been scattered through the brain and unifying it for that relived moment of experience. How does that help your theophany? Yeah, you bet.
I have another Zoom question. Have you seen any effects that hallucinogenics might have on encounters with God or the Spirit?
Yeah. And now we can check that box off our bingo card. I appreciate the question. I'm only teasing. It's kind of funny. So I have not done one single study on psychedelics, and yet I keep getting invited to speak at these psychedelic conferences. I was even able to go to Oxford and to participate in a debate on psychedelics, and I was like, you guys realize I have zero credentials to talk about this, but that's the zeitgeist right now, that it's spirituality, psychedelics. So yes, the short answer is yes, there is a strong association there where psychedelics reliably induce mystical type experiences. Again, I'm looking around the room and seeing all these Jesuits who could wax far more philosophically eloquent than I can right now about discernment and about proximate causes versus, the non-proximity or no apparent proximate cause. I've got a special love and affection for Teresa of Avila, and in Spanish, she has a really clever turn of phrase where she says, many people think that they're experiencing, let me see if I can remember it, arrobamiento, but it's abomamiento. So basically she's saying many people think they're experiencing a rapture, but they're experiencing foolishness. And I would say that, yes, the simple answer is yes. There is a strong, clear, causal association between psychedelics and hallucinogenics and the experience of some kind of mystical type phenomenon. I would say, though, remember what we just saw about the brain circuits for delusion. And if we're now ingesting a substance that also reliably is down-regulating our networks that are involved in intellect and reasoning, that we just have to be especially careful and discerning, rather than assuming that, okay, any type of phenomenon that I have subsequent to the consumption of psychedelics or hallucinogenics must be an edict from the divine throne.
Yeah, this is about the seizures.
Okay, yes.
I have worked with many people that had various degrees of epileptic episodes. And I tried to discover some kind of indicator of what would lead to try and anticipate. And in conversations with them and discussions among themselves, the one thing that came up was that about 24 to 36 hours before the episode started, they would have religious experience.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a long-standing historical observation that there is an association of seizure, or as we now call it epilepsy because we think of it as a condition as opposed to one-off seizures, although one-off seizures do occur as well. And then something that has a spiritual or religious quality to it. This was particularly characterized by a neurologist in the mid to late 20th century named Norman Geschwind. And it was a pattern of symptoms that presented so reliably that they just said, we're just going to name this syndrome after you. So it's called Geschwind syndrome. And especially there are 3 symptoms that co-occur. One, hypergraphia. In other words, just like compulsive writing, that it's like you just want to write and write and write and write and write. 2, hyper-religiosity, where like there is this obsession with religious symbols and religious meaning and religious content. And the 3rd is some kind of atypical sexuality, some change in sexual behavior. Why is it that these symptoms occur in a set why is it that, especially of interest here, those hyper-religious symptoms are associated with seizure? So a couple of different potential responses there. One, a phenomenal response. In other words, like a subjective account that speaks to this. The second being a neural response that I've begun to look at. With the subjective phenomenal accounting, Dostoevsky, the Russian novelist, was a known epileptic. He had repeated numerous seizures. And he writes very eloquently through the voicing of his characters in The Idiot about the experience of ecstatic seizure. And in short, he says, you normals have no idea what it's like the moment before you're gripped by a seizure. And he said, I would give up everything in my life for that one moment of bliss. And then he says that there is such an exquisite harmony in that moment that after the fact, there's no room to even doubt that that potential synthesis of life is in reality possible. From the neural accounting, one of the things that I've done is look at the seizures and their onset zones that are more likely to be associated with an increase in religiosity afterward. And I was specifically testing the hypothesis that if a seizure starts within that periaqueductal gray circuit, that it's more likely to be associated with some kind of a religious increase in behavior. And so this is actually a result that I report in that biological psychiatry paper, that there is an association with the seizure starting in the periaqueductal gray circuit and it being more likely to result in a seizure, contrasted to seizures that don't have any type of religious outcome with them. Those are more likely to originate outside of that periaqueductal gray circuit.
Next question is a Zoom question. Did I understand that the study involved brains with lesions? Has the work been done with brains with no known pathology?
Yep, great question here. So again, short answer and then the long answer. Short answer is yes, and that results are converging with the studies that are being done in brain lesions. I do want to emphasize again that one of the reasons why this paradigm of using brain lesions is really catching hold is again because we're trying to go beyond correlational data and into causal data. And to do that ethically and responsibly with human participants, we have to rely on natural events. It's just so ethically fraught to say we're now going to go in and to experimentally lesion or to experimentally stimulate a deep brain region, especially one like the periaqueductal gray that's involved in so many autonomic basic functions. The liability and the ethics of going in and causally tinkering that deeply in the human brain are non-starters. And so if we're trying to get to something that is causal rather than only correlational, then lesions become a really good paradigm. Okay, going back though to the work on individuals who don't present with some kind of a pathology. One of the things I'm doing is going back right now and looking at those participants who we originally brought in for the LDS study at the University of Utah to examine the association of increases of activity in the periaqueductal gray with the reports of feeling the spirit. Admittedly, I'm not shy about this. It was a small study. It was a pilot study. We had 19 participants, which is not a huge number to statistically power an effect. One of the technical matters within brain imaging is what's called multiple comparison corrections. Okay, so let me break down what that means. Statistics lesson here. So if you see p less than 0.05, what that means is that you have less than a 5% chance of that result being a false positive. In tandem with that, what that means is that if you do that same thing 20 times, at least 1 out of 20 times, you would expect it to be a false positive. In other words, you would say, yes, there is an association here, when the ground truth is that there's not an association. This becomes challenging when we're looking at 200,000 voxels in the brain. So a voxel is a volumetric pixel. It's the 3D digital cube that we use to construct a three-dimensional image of the brain. And when we're doing brain imaging statistics, we're making a statistical test for each one of those volumetric pixels. So again, with a frequentist statistic of a p of 0.05, where you would expect 1 out of every 20 tests is going to give you a false positive. Well, if you're doing 200,000 tests, just off the bat, you would expect about 10,000 of them to be false positives. So what we end up doing for the statistics of brain imaging is cranking our statistical thresholds way higher than you would apply for any type of single statistical test. And so what that means, though, is that we end up erring by design on the side of false negatives. We end up tossing out a lot of things that are probably real associations because we want to err on the side of a false negative rather than on the side of a false positive. But now that we have this hypothesis specific for the periaqueductal gray, we can do a post hoc analysis to go back and to look at these voxels that are specific to that region of the brain. And with the fresh lens that we have coming off of this study, test whether there is some association. So again, stay tuned. And I also hope to be repeating this experiment with a larger base of participants so that we can have a more rigorously statistically powered outcome.
Hi. So on the topic of using spirituality in the context of behavioral health,
Yeah.
Dr. Young and I from the Harvard Medical School, Department of Psychiatry, we're working on that issue now. And one thing that we found to be exceedingly difficult is actually defining spirituality in a way that is comprehensible cross-culturally, because he works very heavily with the Chinese American population, and even defining spirituality in a way that can be comprehended from different cultural regions. So I want to know what your thoughts on the prospect of a universal spiritual language would be. I'm inclined to believe that there could be, given that in schizophrenic patients, the hyper-religiosity that they exhibit can take on forms of religion and spirituality that they have never even encountered from all across the globe. So,
really great question there. And that's I'm also caught up in the last bit of information that you shared as a part of your question. I would actually love to hear more about the cases that either you have seen or that you have read about where there's a presentation of religious content that was not directly a part of the individual's background experience. That's really, really, really fascinating. So it is really important that we have strong concepts and not just clever terms, so that we can recognize, this is the same thing that I'm really interested in studying. It's almost a trope at this point, but Shakespeare always says a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. And so it's I'm not attached to the word spirituality per se, so much as I'm interested in the phenomenon of a person connecting with something divine or transcendent. Zooming in again on that last bit of information that you shared about this observation that there are individuals who present with religious content that is not a part of their immediate surrounding. I think that there's really rich work to redeem Carl Jung, of all people. When you start looking at archetypal psychology, for a series of unfortunate events, Freud ended up becoming the guy. But even you look at William James and his associations with Carl Jung, there's a lot that hasn't had its full day in the sun with regard to the experiences that we're carrying with us from our shared evolutionary heritage, and that are getting expressed in forms of symbols that then start popping up in places, not because there's some kind of sociocultural imprint per se, but perhaps because it really is a part of the rich information base inherent to our bodies.
Our next question is a Zoom question. Has any research been done on the effect of spiritual practices on plasticity in the PAG? And has any research been done on the effect of PAG lesions on classical conditioning, which might explain the link to delusion formation?
Wow, really great questions here. So there is a lot more work on the PAG that's been done in rodents. And it makes it difficult to translate these spirituality concepts into non-human animal studies. We can approximate it. Again, we can look at some of the shared features of self-sacrificing behaviors, and so looking at nurturing instincts. And it does turn out that if you go into rats, you directly electrically stimulate the PAG, that they have an increase in their nurturing behavior for their young. With regard to neuroplasticity in the PAG, a lot of the work that I've seen has been looking at neuroplasticity in the cortex. The cortex of the brain just seems like it is a more highly malleable component of the brain than something like the brainstem. So I have not seen that data looking at plasticity specific in the PAG. However, let's keep in mind though that with this perspective of circuits, we're not only interested in the PAG itself, we really are interested in the distributed connections of the PAG. And so in that regard, yes, we do see plasticity in regions in the cortex connected to the PAG, even if it's not the nucleus itself. And then the question with regard to fear extinction, can you repeat that part of the question, if you don't mind? I'll also do a better job of not having you have to go back and retrieve questions that you already asked.
Here it is. Has any research been done on the effect of PAG lesions on classical conditioning, which might explain the link to delusion formation?
Not that I know of. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but I'm not familiar with any work in that vein. But it's a good question.
Hi, my background is psychology and religion, and the whole time I know nothing about neurology at all. But the whole time you were talking, I kept saying Carl Jung, I said William James, I don't know if Lawrence Lachon, I don't know if you know him.
I'm not familiar with that
And
personality.
Eugene Genlin.
Okay.
Do you know Genlin?
I don't.
No? Okay.
Tell me about them.
Well, Lachon did a lot of work on healing, and he trained himself to be a healer. He was a philosopher, and he was a very solid guy, or whatever. And I took some of the training. It was just utterly fascinating. A healing meditation kind of thing that he proposed. And Genlin worked with Carl Rogers and very open to spirituality. And matter of fact, one of those spiritual people, I got to know him kind of well, that I know, died a few years ago. He was 90 years old. But all four of them, I don't know what I'm asking, but right away they came to mind, those four people.
I appreciate that. No, I will, mark my word, I will go back and replay the tape to get those names. I'm not going to be able to retain them right now, but I'm interested, especially if you're seeing some kind of a conceptual resonance. I'm interested in seeing what their work has to say.
Oh yeah. I mean, you're blowing my mind. But again, I know nothing about neuropsychology at all. But you're describing these people, I think.
I'm excited then. Thank you.
Our next Zoom question. It's interesting that Joseph Smith sees the glory of God as the intellect when he had a fairly intense affective experience with God's revelation to him, if I understand his story correctly. Can you comment? Did he acknowledge affective experience?
Yeah, great question. And you also have to look at different time points in Joseph Smith's life, because he, like many of us, was on a developmental journey. And so at different periods, there are things that are more salient, more present, more clearly occupying his mind. So at the time that text is being produced for the Book of Mormon, bracketing questions about ultimate authorship, you have at the very end of the Book of Mormon something that is a blatant appeal to affective mysticism. The Book of Mormon closes with this invitation to pray about it and to invite an affective confirmation. It's been a little bit even perhaps uncharitably pilloried because sometimes the term burning in the bosom is used, and people dismiss that and think like, oh, this is just sentimentalism. But there is more depth to the way in which Smith prescribed that we discern those affective mystical experiences, and particularly talks about an alignment between the mind and the heart. And so, says that when you have the clarity both in your mind and in your heart, that you can place more confidence in that. So I would say that it might be fair to say that like a more fully matured articulation of Smith's spirituality was one where it was an integration of both intellective and affective, a flaming sword, if you will, rather than one being separated from the other.
Thanks very much. This was fascinating. And I'm sure you've considered this sort of foundational question, but the guiding principle seems to be that the paradigm case of spirituality is sort of the individual, whether or not in a scan machine, or certainly the individual under some kind of self-reflection or introspection or encounter with the text. And I understand that you have to start with individual cases and individual brains, but does that introduce a sort of assumption about what spirituality is that in some ways runs counter to a kind of foundational, say, at least Christian principle that it's primarily, say, Eucharistic, or it's primarily communal? And
didn't Jesus say, where one is by themselves in a brain scanner, there I
That's
shall
right,
be
that's right.
also?
Yeah, no, that's the basic question. I'm sure it's a big question, and it's no way to kind of undermine the value of this research, but does that kind of introduce a kind of counter principle to what you're ultimately might be exploring as a Christian?
Very much so, and I'm really glad that you asked that question. That is a direction that I really want to go as my own career matures, is to take two different approaches. One, there are these enormously complex get-ups where you have multiple fMRI machines that are all interlinked with each other, and so you can have some kind of a communal experience where everybody is in. Yeah. Right. And that's the second direction. So the first direction is, okay, have static machines where there's some kind of communication interlinking them, and approximate as best you can in what is still a very unnatural research environment, some kind of group or communal experience. But the other would be to use some kind of measure like EEG was suggested. There's also FNIRS, functional near infrared spectroscopy, which is actually measuring the same physiological signal. It's the BOLD signal, the blood oxygen level dependent signal. But the thing with these portable devices, there's always a trade-off. Even though you can take the portable devices into more ecologically valid environments, you could take them into the Carmelite monastery, and I have it on good faith that once I get portable devices, the brothers will participate in experiments where they pray in their cell, then they pray together in the chapel, and then we look at what the differences are, both phenomenologically and neurophysiologically. And I hope that you're watching, because I'm holding you to that, friars. But the trade-off is that you're not going to be able to get the depth imaging that you can get when you're doing something like an fMRI, and you've got this enormous rig. There's also, I'll just really, really quickly here say that there's trade-offs as well, not just in terms of the size of the scanner or the portability of the scanner, but in terms of this spatial versus this temporal precision. It's a trade-off. We can either be really, really precise at where a neural event is happening, or we can be really, really precise about when a neural event is happening. But it's super hard, not impossible, but super, super hard to integrate both the spatial and the temporal precision to say this is exactly where this is happening and this is exactly when this is happening. So to recap, you're spot on. Yeah, that is baked into the central tenets of Christian spirituality, that there's something unique where 2 or 3 are gathered with the name of Christ that is not anticipated to happen when an individual is participating alone. It's, again, like clearly it's not to say that there's nothing valid about individual contemplative spirituality. Clearly I'm not saying that. But this is a question I do hope to chase after as my own career develops and matures. Oh my gosh, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Spirituality, therapeutics seems to be a term describing many of the assessments and care provided by hospital chaplains. Any research on such care and their neural correlates?
Yeah, great question. So I've started, any research? Yes, there is some research. Part of the difficulty with doing studies in the hospital setting and with the interface of chaplaincy in the hospital setting is that like you have people who are in severe distress. So then to operationalize and say, oh, we really need you to be very standardized here, and we really need you to comply with this protocol, and oh, well, this isn't going to work because this variable introduces a confound. It's just messy. Human life is messy. Human life in crisis is messier. And that's really, really, really hard to fit human life in crisis with all of its urgent messiness into clean experimental standards. So there is some research, but it's just inherently going to be a different variety of research than that type of ultra squeaky clean, precise laboratory type of experimentation.